good afternoon and welcome to this lunchtime Governors for Schools conference session. My name is Oliver Keane and I'm Governor Insight Manager here at Governors for Schools. In this session, we're joined by Leora Cruddas, who's CEO of the Confederation of School Trusts, who'll be making the case today that collaboration is hardwired into the structure of school trusts, particularly multi-academy trusts, and can lead to school improvement. But before we get started, I have a few administrative and housekeeping notes. For those who are visually impaired, all speakers in our sessions will be sharing a brief verbal description of themselves. I'm male, white British, mid-30s, with light brown short hair. Closed captions are available, and if these aren't visible currently, you can switch them on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen. Chat function has been disabled, but please do send any questions in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. The session is being recorded, and links to the video will be sent out following the session. And we'll also send links to the slides, resources, and contact details of Leora. Please continue to follow the conference this week and like and share any content you see on social media and use the hashtag GfS Conference 21. And there is a short survey following the session that we'd be really happy if you filled in for us. So by way of introduction, Leora is the Chief Executive of the Confederation of School Trusts, and that's the national organisation and sector body for school trusts in England. The CST currently supports and represent more than half of the academy sector in England. Leora herself has advised successive governments and sits on several Department for Education advisory bodies, and she's also the Vice Chair of the Head Teacher Standards Review Group. Prior to establishing CST, she was Director of Policy and Public Relations for the Association of School and College Leaders, and just before leaving that post, Leora established the Commission for Ethical Leadership, on which she served as a commissioner. Previously, Leora spent 6 years as the Director of Education in 2 London local authorities and has extensive experience at senior executive level of working with schools and trusts to improve the effectiveness and quality of education. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to Leora.
Thank you so much, Ollie, for those lovely words of introduction. And can I say how delighted I am to be contributing to the conference today. So I'm just very quickly going to share my screen. There you are. So I've been asked to talk to you today about the power of a group of schools working together. So I'm going to make the case for collaboration, and I use that word quite deliberately and quite carefully. So I'm not going to make an argument for academization per se, but rather talk to you about the power of a group of schools working together in a single governance structure and make the case to you for collaboration. Firstly, though, I would like to just say a little bit about my organisation following Ollie's introduction. So as Ollie said, we are the national organisation and sector body for academy and multi-academy trusts in England. So we have 3, if you like, strategic aims. The first is to advocate for the sector, to stand up for the sector when perhaps the sector is under attack by others. And I'll say a bit more today in the course of the presentation about some myths that are perpetrated in the national discourse about the work that the trust sector does, but also in terms of advocacy, speaking confidently and authoritatively to government. So before I founded CST, there was no national organisation that had the authority to speak on behalf of the sector to government and indeed across political parties and to Parliament. And I should say that CST is politically neutral. We are required to be politically neutral because we're a charity, but even if we weren't required to be politically neutral, we would be. So we work across Parliament and across political parties, and we do work with the government of the day to advocate for and represent the interests of our members. So that's on advocacy. Our second strategic aim is to connect the sector up. And we do a huge amount of that. And that work has become even more important in the context of the global pandemic. So what would be awful is if we were building a sector of isolationist organizations who only looked inwards and only cared about the children that they were educating in their group of schools. So we want to build a connected sector, an interconnected sector that understands that we should leave no school and indeed no child behind in the reform journey. And the third of our strategic aims is to support the sector. So I think we are one of the very few organisations who have a professional development offer, a support offer, a guidance offer that speaks directly to the trust sector and specialises, if you like, in trust governance and trust leadership. So that's really important for us. So the concept of a sector body perhaps is not that well understood in education. We're used to different types of organizations. You know, for example, the two leadership trade unions, ASCL and NHT, we are not a trade union. If you join CST, it is your organization, your trust that joins CST. So not your CEO, not the chair of the trust board, but the trust itself. That's a really significant difference between us and other types of national organizations that operate in the sector. And in that, we're quite similar, if you like, to the NHS Confederation or NHS providers, which are the voice of the NHS trust sector. So outside of education, this notion of the sector body, the body that represents and speaks for organizations, not individuals, is quite well understood. So I founded CST coming on to 3 years ago. I'm delighted to say we now represent nearly 60% of the entire sector of all academy schools. And that's been a really interesting journey to have gone on in the last 3 years, and indeed in the last 18 months through the global pandemic. So I thought I would start off by just exploring different kinds of partnerships, because certainly when I make the case for collaboration, you know, I'm not attempting to say that the structure of the trust is the only kind of partnership. I will be advocating for it as the strongest form of partnership, but I'm certainly not saying it's the only way in which schools can work together, can collaborate together. So this is probably not a completely comprehensive list, but I think it's a good start, and hopefully you'll recognise some of these different forms of partnership. So I'll start with the notion of the federation. So as Ollie said, part of my background is local government. I was very proud to serve as a Director of Education in 2 London local authorities. And when I was Director of Education, there was a lot of talk about federations as the way you construct partnerships between schools. So there's an important difference, though, between a soft federation and a hard federation. And I just wanted to explore that a little bit. So the soft federation is when a group of schools, or perhaps a group of head teachers, want to work together, usually on some project. Absolutely fine, good for the system, good for children, good for teachers, but there is no hardwiring of that partnership into governance. So it's soft in the sense that any partner at any time can walk away from that piece of work or from that partnership. There's no requirement to stay in those relationships. So that's a soft federation. Then we come to sort of teaching school alliances, as were now teaching school hubs. So what I'm loosely calling the professional development partnership. So these are partnerships, obviously, that now with the teaching school hubs are contracted by government to deliver a range of government programs in this case. So teaching school hubs are organised around delivering a range of reformed government programs. So the early career framework, for example, the reformed national professional qualifications. So partnerships with a purpose, very important partnerships in the landscape. Then there's broadly what I'd call improvement partnerships. So we've got a number of national organizations that work to support schools and trusts to do peer review, for example. Again, really important forms of partnership, and make a huge difference, I think, to the schools and trusts that participate in those improvement partnerships. I would say that national leaders of education are also an improvement partnership. So a national leader of education, or indeed a national leader of governance, is asked to support a school or a trust on their improvement journey. So in that relationship, I think that's an improvement partnership. So the fourth form of partnership I want to talk about is the contracted partnership. So that's slightly more formal than the other forms of partnership I've talked about up until now. And that is where a school or a trust contracts under a partnership agreement, or indeed a legal agreement, with another school or a trust to offer support. That support can be a multitude of different ways. So it can be school improvement support, it can be executive leadership support, it can be support to supply some middle leaders, perhaps, or can be back office support. But the important thing there is some form of legal agreement. So there's more of a hardwiring of the two partners together, underpinned by a contract or by a legal agreement. Then there's the hard federation. Now, I made reference to the fact that I was a director of education, all the talk was federation. So some of the talk was soft federation, some of the talk was hard federation. So hard federation is typically when two maintained schools decide they want to form a partnership, but the partnership is consolidated at governance level. So there's typically a single governing board over those two schools. Sometimes that's an infant in a junior school. Sometimes it could be a school that is perhaps not done very well in an offset inspection. So different reasons why schools would choose to form a hard federation. Typically, those are brokered by a local authority, supported by a local authority, and of course, the schools in the hard federation continue to be maintained by the local authority. And then finally, the form of partnership that I'll focus on pretty much for the rest of this presentation is the Multiacademy Trust. So this is the most secure and the hardest, if you like, form of partnership. This is where a group of schools come together in a single legal entity under a single governance structure, the Trust Board. And I'll say quite a lot more about why I think that is really very, very important. So I'll focus first on partnerships with shared governance arrangements. So if you recall, there are two kinds of partnerships, or at least two kinds of partnerships with shared governance arrangements: the hard federation in the maintained sector and the Multi-Academy Trust. And I'm really interested that Chapman and Mers did a study back in 2014. Now, if you think about the 2010 Academies Act as being the sort of time at which really groups of schools and multi-academy trusts started to form at scale, this research was published 4 years after that legislation. That's very, very short period of time. If you think Chapman and Mers would have been doing their research in that period, in that early period. So in their research, they talk about performance federations. And what they mean by that is schools in a shared governance arrangement. So that includes the early multi-academy trusts. So the findings of their research are quite interesting. They suggest that students in these performance federations, these hard forms of governance, outperform a matched sample of their peers in non-federated schools in terms of their attainment. So quite early on, there's some indication that actually the group of schools working in a shared governance arrangement is actually doing something that probably has an impact outcomes and indeed life chances of children. So what is a multi-academy trust? This is our definition at CST, which sort of mirrors the legal definition, but I do want to pull one thing out of this. So multi-academy trust, group of schools, in our view, working in deep and purposeful collaboration. Those are actually David Hargreaves' words back in the early 2000s, deep and purposeful collaboration as one entity, as a single entity, to improve and maintain high educational standards across the trust. Now, what's really important to me, and we'll find out a little bit more when we look at myth busting, is that there's quite a lot sort of in the public discourse, in the way that, you know, multi-academy trusts get talked about in public, that says this is the privatization of education. These are private organizations run for private profit. No, definitely not. So the Multi-Academy Trust has a single legal and moral purpose at the heart of its Articles of Association. The Articles of Association, I'm sure you'll know, is the governance document. And it's this: to advance education for public benefit. Now that seems to me really very important. Multi-academy trusts, or any academy trust, we prefer the term school trust because we think the term multi-academy trust and the really horrible acronym MAT, I don't like that at all. That is something that parents don't really understand. And if they do understand it, they haven't always got the best associations with that term MAT. But all parents know what a school is, right? So, you know, what is a multi-academy trust? Technically, it's a group of schools, so it's a school trust. At the heart of that legal document, the Articles of Association, that governance document, is the moral purpose: to advance education for public benefit. Now, I could talk about this for quite a long time, but I won't, because we don't have enough time. So I talk about this quite a lot, both to our members, but also to the increasing number of maintained schools who contact CST to find out, what does it mean to join a trust, or indeed to form a trust, or to think about converting? What does that mean? How do you do it? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? And in those conversations, I always say, I think you shouldn't ask the question, should my school become an academy? I think that's the wrong question. By the way, it was actually Steve Mumby who posed these two questions, not me, which is why they in inverted commas. So the wrong question is, should my school become an academy? I don't really know the answer to that question. It's a legal vehicle. Yes, maybe assess, you know, what the legal vehicle might offer. You know, it's not the question that interests me. A much better question is, how can my school best collaborate with other schools in a strong and resilient structure, and I'll talk about resilience a bit more later on, to ensure that every child is a powerful learner, and that adults, the teachers, all the staff, not just the teachers, all adults have the opportunities to learn and develop together. That's the question I'm interested in. And I think there's a much more straightforward answer to that question than, should my school become an academy? So if you're listening today and you are thinking about the future of your school, what you might become, I would encourage you to ask the second question rather than the first question. So why am I an advocate of trusts? What can trusts do that possibly other forms of partnership can do, but there'd be more risk associated with it? And remember, my background as the Director of Education, my background is local government. So, you know, I know the maintain sector really well. So I think a group of schools working together in a single entity can do things that it is harder for standalone schools to do. Not impossible, but harder. So teachers and leaders can learn together. It's professional development that runs across the trust, a compelling professional development offer that is based on the best evidence, that follows the best evidence, that really makes a difference to the quality of teaching. I think that's something that is much better done across a group of schools, because you create professional communities of teachers in their subjects. So very powerful forms of learning that can happen. I think teachers and leaders can work together on the things that matter, like curriculum and assessment. And that's really, really important, to have a conversation in a community of leaders to whom you are bound in solidarity with a common purpose, a common set of values, to talk within your professional peer group about curriculum and assessment. Those are powerful conversations, and to be bound to each other in those outcomes. So I'm interested in this as a notion of solidarity and intercollaboration and connectedness. I'm really not interested in autonomy, I have to say. I think autonomy is usually talked about as shoring up the interests of adults, not what's best for children. So I'm much more interested in solidarity, connectedness, interrelatedness. Those, I think, are powerful words with moral purpose. I think there's some evidence, and I'll talk about it in a minute, that schools where the quality of education is not good enough can be supported to improve. And there's a beautiful example of that that's just in my mind at the moment. But there are lots of examples of this, but I'll just give one. North Shore Academy in the north of England has just been judged by Ofsted to be outstanding under the governance and the leadership of the Northern Education Trust. That school has never been good in its history, and now it's outstanding. Such is the power of collaboration, the power of the group of schools working together to care for each other, to care for each other's schools, and to care about what happens to the children in those schools. So it's this collaborative nature, the collaborative structure of the trust, that I think makes it more possible for leaders and teachers to work together. And there's also some evidence from the NFER that the movement, particularly of leaders in a trust, is from more advantaged schools to less advantaged schools. And that seems to be really important in terms of moral purpose for me too. So I said I would do something about myths and facts. So here's the first myth, the idea that academy trusts are businesses, that they run by private people, and that they are for profit. That is simply not true. So this is not an ideological argument. I'm not saying ideologically I don't think it's true. I'm telling you it's not true. So they're not businesses. They're education charities. They are in law companies as well. Education charities. They're not run by private people. They're run by charity trustees who have legal duties and legal responsibilities to advance education for public benefit. And they cannot in law make a profit. So those seem to me to be really important principles. So second myth, this idea that trusts are not part of state-funded education. Yes, they are, absolutely. Like any other state school, the academy school is free to attend. It's inspected in the same way. The children take the same tests and exams. Parents don't pay fees. The school and the trust has to operate in accordance with their funding agreement, which is a contract they have with the Secretary of State. So they're absolutely a part of state-funded education. Thirdly, this idea that somehow academy trusts don't have the same legal responsibilities towards the most vulnerable children in our society, towards children with special educational needs and disabilities. No, they have the same legal responsibilities. absolutely the same responsibilities in law as any other type of state school. And I've listed some of them there for you if you're interested. So that seems to me to be really important kind of piece of misinformation, this idea that somehow trusts can operate outside of legal frameworks that bind in other forms of state schools. This is quite a common one as well, and I've seen this a lot as an objection to schools converting. So it's this idea that land is passed into private ownership. So again, it's this notion of private just isn't right. These are public institutions, these are civic institutions, charitable entities, charitable trusts. And you know, most trusts hold their sites on a lease from a local authority for a nominal charge, but there are controls on the disposal of land, just like there are controls on the disposal of land for maintained schools. So really important to be quite factual here. And then finally, this notion that trusts are not accountable, that it's the Wild West out there. Really not so. Trusts are held to a higher standard, in fact, than maintained schools. So the obligation of transparency and accountability is much greater than in maintained schools in multitude of ways. So, for example, the trust leader, as the accounting officer, is directly accountable to Parliament. That's not true in the maintained sector. Trusts are required to have independent audit, they're required to publish their accounts. This is a highly, highly accountable part of the sector. And this is also, you might say, well, there are many more investigations into trusts than there are into maintained schools. I don't think we can claim that. Again, I know this from having been a director of education. If I, as director of education, commission an investigation into one of the schools the local authority maintains, I'm not required to publish that investigation report. I'm not required to put it in the public, not at all. But if a trust is investigated by the ESFA, and you know, rightly so, that we have a regulator that does investigate, absolutely right. But those reports are published, and they are published also in the same place. So it is right that legal entities are held to account and are regulated, and I personally wouldn't have it any other way. That's absolutely right. But I just wanted to give you a flavour of the kinds of accountabilities that trusts are subject to. And then this thorny issue of, so do trusts improve pupil outcomes? So I've given you some early evidence from that Chapman and Mers study. This is some more evidence, some statistical analysis done by the NFER, which suggested that pupils in converter multi-academy trusts do better than pupils in comparable standalone maintained schools. Now, I don't want to claim too much for this, actually, because converter schools could convert because they had a good or outstanding Ofsted judgment. So it sort of stands to reason that standards in that part of the sector might actually be higher. So I'm not claiming too much of it. I just wanted to put it there for you. So this is not the same for sponsor-led trusts. So sponsor-led trusts are the trusts that take on schools that are really struggling, that have had a poor Ofsted judgment, that perhaps, like North Shore Academy, haven't been good. This is not the same for sponsor-led trusts. But then you would also expect that. So if these trusts are taking on the schools that are really struggling, you would expect that outcomes might not be the same as other types of school other types of the schools in the school sector. But these trusts are obviously working in a much greater level of challenge. So there's some beginning to be some emerging evidence around outcomes, but you know, the trust sector is an emerging sector. It's only really properly at scale been around for 10 years, and in public policy terms, that's quite short. But the emerging evidence is positive. This I think is really interesting. As of August 2020, of course, we haven't had Ofsted data during the pandemic. 75% of sponsored primary and secondary academies that had been inspected are good or outstanding, compared to only 10% of their predecessor schools. So I think that really does begin to show that trusts do a good job of supporting their schools to improve. So talk to you now about some other evidence, and I'll go through this quite quickly because I want to ensure that we've got time to do Q&A. This is from the Education Select Committee, quite an early Education Select Committee report from the 2013-14 session. It's a quote from the report: "We believe that school partnerships with clear lines of accountability and some element of obligation are more likely to be successful." So really, those are school partnerships working together and in a single governance arrangement. I found this very interesting. This is also from the Education Select Committee from the 2014-15 session. This is about what primary heads were saying at the time. Primary heads told us that whilst becoming an academy had improved their practice and their school, it was because of the advantages generated by the collaborative framework of the trust. So coming back to this notion of collaboration as being really quite important to the sustained improvement of schools. I'll touch on this report, but I won't spend long on it. This is an Ofsted report from January 2020 called Fight or Flight: How Stuck Schools are Overcoming Isolation. You might not like the term stuck schools. That's Ofsted's language, not mine. It's a fascinating report, and I think because of when it was published, it didn't actually get that much attention. Ofsted analysed the range of school improvement initiatives over the last 20 years, and they could conclude that too much advice was given to schools who are struggling. And this advice was not really consistent, and it was not really necessarily of high quality. They found that there are two circumstances where actually the external advice was given to a school really helped the school. And one of those two circumstances was where designated leaders from staff within the trust, not outside of it, worked in a sustained way with the school to ensure improvement. So they talk about the strategic oversight, the accountability inherent in the trust structure as being able to drive evidence-informed improvement. That seems to me a really important finding. We asked Ofsted to delve a bit deeper into the way that schools were being supported by their trusts in the pandemic. So we took a bit of a risk in doing this because, of course, we could have got evidence back that where schools, where head teachers, where governors said, actually, we're not being supported at all. The opposite is true. Ofsted got overwhelming evidence that, that school leaders believed that the support of the trust was crucial during the pandemic. So this is the conclusion by Mers and Sampson. So this is Ofsted saying this, not me. One of the aims of bringing schools together in trusts is to support them with levels of support and collective learning that would not be achievable for any school on its own. These findings, Ofsted's findings, show how important this can be to schools' resilience in the most challenging of circumstances, and how being part of a greater whole builds that resilience. So that seems to me, again, to be a really important finding, not from me, but from Ofsted. Our position at CST is that the structure of the trust is robust. And we use that in a sort of technical definition of robustness as a system's ability to maintain its functions or its characteristics in the face of external shocks and perturbations. And of course, never was there a greater external shock or perturbation, certainly in living memory, than that caused by the global pandemic. So we use that term in quite a technical way. We worked with the University of Nottingham to commission some research about this notion of trusts as robust structures. And I'm really pleased that the University of Nottingham found that trust schools broadened traditional definitions of disadvantaged, that they worked really hard with this group. That's not to say that maintained schools didn't. Of course, every leader, every teacher, every person working in education was absolutely incredible and worked well beyond what they might have been expected to be able to do. You know, to feed children, to care about their welfare, to find out what's going on, to move to remote education. Every teacher, every leader, every member of school staff did this. The difference is the robustness of the structure within which they were working. So why is any of this important? Why is it important to think about the future of your school? Why is it important to stay in control of that future? Why is it important to think about the collaborative structures which, as we've seen, support a school and support a school to support its pupils? Why is any of this important? Because in the words of the late, great Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations, who wrote a preface in the year 2000 to a report on the state of the world's children, he said, "There is no trust more sacred than the one the world holds with children." CST's single vision statement is that we build a system of education in England that holds trust with children. I'm going to stop there and pass back to Ollie for questions.
Thank you very much for that illuminating and rigorous presentation. I've got a question about governance. We're a governance charity, and most of our audience will be connected with governance in some way. We hear a lot about the role of governance in multi-academy trusts and how it operates, in particular around, in some cases, the diminished role of governors as they move into that structure. I just wondered where you stand on that, really, and whether it's something that you think is part and parcel of becoming a multi-academy trust, or whether it's something that is more variable, really.
Yeah. Excellent question. The first thing I'd say is I don't think there's a diminished role for governors. I do think that the proposition of governing a maintained school is fundamentally different from the proposition of governing a trust. And I think we conflate those two propositions really at our peril. There are a number of ways in which the trust is different from maintained governance. Firstly, I guess the trust is a legal entity. Trustees have company law duties and charity law duties, which governors don't have. The trust board is the employer. So in some maintained schools, the governing body will be the employer, but typically the governing body isn't the employer, it's the local authority. So, as a legal entity, the trust board holds all the risk, for example. So that proposition of governance needs to be looked at in its own right in the trust sector. And so that's part of the reason why I say I don't think it's a lesser role for the local tier of governance. I think I like to use the term governance community within a trust because particularly a multi-academy trust is a complex entity. It's obviously not the governance of a single school, it's the governance of a group of schools. So governance is not only a different proposition, but it's a more complex proposition. In that more complex proposition of governance, you definitely need a local tier of governance because you need that local tier of governance to be connected into the community, to be the ambassador of the trust in the community. You need that local tier of governance to really know the school, or sometimes it's a small group of schools that a local governing board would oversee. You really need those local governors to know that school, to be strong advocates for that school, to be scrutinizing performance and standards, to be ensuring safety and safeguarding. This is not a dilution of the role of governance. It's a different proposition, but it's not a dilution. And I think that local tier of governance is absolutely essential.
How would you say that the local governors can ensure that the collaboration that's going on across the trust is as effective as it can be?
I mean, I think part of the responsibilities of anybody involved in the task of governance at whatever tier of governance they operate in is that they feel able to offer constructive challenge. They need to be able to feel able to offer constructive challenge to the head teacher of the school or the schools that they have responsibility for, but they could also perfectly legitimately offer constructive challenge upwards to the trust board if they feel, you know, the communication is not as good as it might be, or they want to propose different ways in which they might be involved in perhaps the more strategic conversations. Perfectly legitimate, and everybody in the governance community should feel able to do that.
How would a governing board, a maintained governing board, go about starting the process of considering multi-academy status? What questions should they be asking among themselves first, and then of the multi-academy trust that they're thinking of joining? So
I gave you, I think, what's the most powerful question about collaboration. How do we collaborate so that every child is a powerful learner, and that leaders and teachers can learn together? That seems to me to be important. I think the other thing is to stay in control of your own destiny. So again, when maintained schools talk to me, I think it's absolutely essential that maintained governors take this question incredibly seriously. It's the future of your school. Of course you must. And of course you must be able to say the things that are worrying you. You know, even I said earlier, I didn't like the word autonomy, even like, yeah, we're worried we'll lose our autonomy. That's perfectly legitimate to be worried about. But I would encourage people to, I suppose, see it the other way. If we weren't so worried about autonomy, if we were more concerned about solidarity, our connectedness to others, how we make sure that our children get the best possible outcomes, that is a more powerful question. It's important that local that governing boards and maintained schools don't feel on the back foot. So they need to feel on the front foot. They need to be proactively thinking about the benefits and indeed the risks of making the decision to convert either into a trust or to form a trust. So it seems to me those are two different options, and both could be on the table at the beginning of the conversation. Are we interested in forming our own trust? So if that's the question, then what follows is, are we a strong and sustainable enough organization to be forming our own trust? And there are a series of questions, for example, in various DfE guidance documents about what regional schools commissioners would look for in answer to that question. But that question about strength, can we do this on our own? Can we form our own trust? Series of questions that follow that from that, including who are we going to form this trust with? Which are the schools? Are we already working together, perhaps in a loose form of partnership, perhaps in a soft federation? Are we as a partnership ready to make that step and convert together into a trust? So that's one option. The other option is, do we want to convert into an existing trust? In which case, which of the trusts that are local to us share our values? Which of the trusts that are local to us are a good fit for us? Do we want to start looking at them and perhaps inviting them in informally to talk to us, so that governing board stays in control? The governing board is inviting the trust in to talk to them, kind of not the other way around. And I think, one of the things that worries me is, as local authorities contract in terms of their school improvement function, and that's not their fault. Obviously, for 10 years, they've had financial settlements, which means they've had to make some hard decisions about where they spend their money. But the school improvement functions in local government are retracting. That leaves particularly smaller schools quite exposed. So for the maintained school to think about how exposed are we going into the future, going into this policy landscape, as our local authority potentially contracts its support to us. How exposed are we, and do we need to make a good decision for children to join a stronger organisation? So those are some of the questions I reckon people should ask.
Are there any sort of bad reasons you would suggest that people perhaps have joined Multiacademy Trust in the past, or taken the decision to convert?
Bad reasons? Well, I mean, I suppose it depends what you mean by bad reasons. When the decision has been taken away from a school because it's failed an offset inspection, that can't be a good place for a school to be. It's not a good place for children to be. So, that's not a good reason. But nevertheless, the governing board can still remain proactive even in those circumstances by working with the regional school commissioner, with the local authority, to determine the right fit for that school, even when they failed an offset inspection. That's still possible to do. I guess my advice would be, in that situation, I'm not sure you should try and pick a fight. I don't think that's the moment to pick a fight when the quality of education in your school is judged to not have been as good as we might all want it to be. So the way to stay in control in those circumstances is to say, right, we now need to find the organisation that's the best fit for us, the organisation that can help to rapidly improve our school, to make sure that we are acting in the best interest of children in the school.
We've got a number of questions coming in around this idea that a school might lose its individual identity, really. And I suppose you've already touched on that, in that you need to choose a trust that aligns with your values. But is there anything else that you can do to guarantee that your school won't be sort of swallowed up in this sort of anonymous kind of structure?
Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining you're reflecting the what's coming in the chat in terms of that language. I would just want to unpack that language a little bit. A school swallowed up in an anonymous structure. The school's not being swallowed up. It's joining a powerful group of schools. It's joining a powerful coalition. That's not being swallowed up. And I don't think the structure's an anonymous structure. The structure's known. And almost all multi-academy trusts have very clearly defined missions, vision, and values. These are typically known. So it's the move of the mental model from I'm in control of my own school and I value the autonomy of my school, towards I'm going to work in solidarity with other schools, understanding the connectedness of my school to this other group of schools and my responsibility to all children. I think it's that shift in our mental model that we need to be making. And then, of course, governing bodies can ask questions about the levels of delegation. And I'd make the question about levels of delegation. I wouldn't be asking a multi-academy trust to come into the room and say, will you protect my school's autonomy? So what? No. Why would we protect the adult interest? We're here for children. So I'm not sure that's the question, but a perfectly legitimate question is, what are the levels of delegation from the trust board to the school? Can we better understand those so that we know when we join your organisation where the decision-making responsibilities sit, what we will be able to exercise control over, where we'll need to align with the trust, but where we can exercise professional judgment for ourselves. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have any thoughts about the size? We've been asked about the ideal size and scale of partnerships.
Yeah. As you can imagine, I get asked about that a lot. And I tend to give this sort of response. If you think of, let's say, a 7 primary school trust in a London borough. Inner London boroughs, typically quite small. Those 7 primary schools are going to be geographically proximate. They're probably going to be walking distance away from each other, if not walking distance, a short drive. Inner London primary schools are typically larger and of course better funded. That 7 primary school trust in Inner London may want to consider its growth journey, but is probably for the meantime sustainable. Take that same trust, 7 primary schools, transport it into rural Devon or coastal Cornwall, and suddenly doesn't look that sustainable. So I don't think there's a perfect size for a trust. I think that's an assessment the trust boards need to make, and that assessment is complex. It is about pupil numbers, it's about number of schools, it's about geographical proximity, it's about rural and coastal deprivation, it's about the capacity of the trust to continue to support its schools. I mean, these are complex assessments. So I try to avoid saying, oh, there's one magic number that everybody should aspire to. I don't think that's right. But I will caveat that by saying that there's still 85% of the trust sector is 5 schools or fewer. And at system level, I don't think that's sustainable. So I think we will have to see some consolidation going forward. But I would caution against thinking that there's a perfect number.
So several questions coming in. We'll try and get through most of them by the end of the session. Do you see a specific role that Academy Trusts can play in the COVID recovery and addressing gaps in attainment and later life outcomes?
Yes.
That's a question.
Yes, and this is the research that we've done on the trust as the robust structure. So trusts, because they're groups of schools, have greater strategic capability and capacity than the single school. They can use that, for example, to follow the best evidence on diagnostic assessment, to make a holistic assessment of a child, not just on lost learning, but on the wider impacts of COVID-19. They can use their financial strategic capability to make sure that the various premia, the recovery premia, the pupil premium, the school-led tuition grant, gets to the right places, to those children who need it most. Because of the strategic capability and capacity, they can offer advice to their schools on the best bets. So follow the evidence and the interventions that have the best outcomes. This is not impossible for a standalone school to do. Not at all. I'm not saying it's not possible. It's just with the greater strategic capability and capacity, and frankly, the thing that I would call many minds, many head teachers working together, I think are going to create more powerful models of what works and models of intervention informed by the evidence than one person working alone.
Great. And a question here from James, just around some of the process of becoming a MAT or joining a MAT. How long are boards looking at? How long is the process from perhaps having the first discussion on the board to actually joining the MAT itself?
I mean, the answer to that is how long is a piece of string? It very much depends on the context. Did you say it was James who asked the question?
Yeah.
So James, we're about to publish some guidance, which we've written with our legal partners, Stone King, on the process of conversion. And if you email me, I will make sure you get a copy of it. So it sets out what the indicative timescales are at each stage. But the reason I say it's how long was a piece of string is it entirely depends on the context of your school. So just as an example, if you're a PFI, that's going to slow down the process, like really significantly. If there's a significant HR issue, possibly an employment tribunal claim that you're sitting on, that's going to slow things down. So there are a huge number of factors that can either work to speed up a conversion or indeed slow it down. So I'll just quickly share my email address with you so that you're able to email me. It's quite simple. It's l.cruddas, my surname, at cstuk.org.uk. So if you email me, I'll make sure you get that guidance. But yeah, it will entirely depend on the context of your school.
Great. I'll just see if we've got anything more coming in. I mean, are there any reasons why a maintained school will be stopped from becoming or joining a MAT? Joining a MAT in particular?
Stopped. So let me just check, by whom? Stopped by whom?
Well, would their application, perhaps could it be rejected by the Department for Education?
So I'm trying to think if I know of any like that. There certainly have been applications to convert that have got held up, sometimes held up by something as important, but as seemingly insignificant as the pension arrangements. So I certainly know of instances like that where things have really got put on the back burner by a small technical detail. As I've already mentioned, PFI can pose a real, not always, but sometimes can pose a real set of challenges to a conversion. I don't think I know of any circumstance where the Department for Education has quite literally turned down the application and said, you can't. Actually, let me just caveat that a little bit more. It also depends on what you're proposing to do. So the regional schools commissioners, as the regulator, will have a view on whether you are trying to convert as a standalone academy. If their assessment is you are not strong enough to convert as a standalone academy, they won't allow that conversion to happen. So that is an example of where it can be stopped, and it has been stopped. If you are wanting to join a trust, but they think it's not the right fit for you, then there's usually a negotiation about that. I don't know that I've ever come across that leading to a conversion not actually happening on those grounds, but there might be conversations, and the process might be a bit protracted if the regulator thinks that you're wanting to join the wrong trust. I think my advice to you is, if you are wanting to convert as a maintained school, have a very early conversation with your RSC. Contact your RSC's office. Talk to them about your ambition and get their early view about it. They might be very positive about a conversion of your school into a trust, but not at all positive about a conversion if you're wanting to convert to be a standalone trust, as an example. So I hope that helps with that answer.
Thank you. We're just about out of time, but thank you very much for a really informative and interesting presentation. I don't know if you have any final points you'd like to raise after answering those questions. They've been quite tough questions at times, but I don't know if you'd like to say anything just to close down this talk.
Yes, perhaps I'll just say that we have a new ministerial team. The previous Secretary of State had sort of indicated his ambition, or the ambition of this government, to complete the reform journey, the ambition of this government for all schools to be part of a strong trust. We've yet to hear what this Secretary of State will say on that matter. But importantly, this is not a change of government, right? This is a change of ministerial team in the DfE, but not a change of government. So I think my advice to you, if you are a maintained school, is do keep the future of your school under active consideration, because you want to be on the front foot, and you want to be making the right decision for the children in the school that you govern. My view is that the future of the education system is the group of schools in England. For the reasons I've said, not because I believe in academization per se, but because I believe in the power of collaboration. And therefore, I would invite you to think in this slightly different way that I've posed. So not about academization, because that's not really that interesting, but about the power of a group of schools really to transform the quality of education and the life chances of children.
Thank you very much, Leora. There is a short survey, as I said, after this session, so we'd be really grateful if you can complete that for us. We're about halfway through our week, our first ever conference. We've got plenty more sessions. You can find details of them all on our website, and there's plenty of time to sign up to them. But once again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Leora for a really great presentation. Thank you very much.